Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Blackhawk Automotive Museum. My name is Tim McGray, and I'm the Executive Director. Thank you all for coming. Sorry, the little background noise we had there a minute ago. This is one of a series of our speaker series we have, and we're very proud to have the gentleman we have this morning. So I'm going to introduce Dave Anderson, and for those of you who don't know, Dave was the former publisher of Pontiac Enthusiast magazine, and more importantly, the driver of the famed GTO Tiger. So Dave, come up and...
I don't need a microphone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, I'm not supposed to walk past this blue line. Thank you all for coming out today. Boy, what a spectacular place to have a presentation. This is, we really thank the Blackhawk Museum for bringing Jim up. And Jim's nearly 88 years old. And he still loves getting out. The reason that Jim's here is because of folks like yourself. You guys adrenalized Jim, and that's why he's still on the road after all these years, sharing his stories and memories. And there are very few people that are still with us who lived those great days of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s in the muscle car and the American performance world. And so I've been privileged to ride shotgun with Jim around the country, heard the stories time in and time again. And there are some great stories, and we're happy to have Jim, the godfather of the GTO, and he's going to talk to you about one of the eras that's most dear to him, and that's the muscle car era. And that's where Jim was out on Woodward Avenue with his Pontiacs and performing all kinds of different hijinks. So what we have today is the anatomy of the muscle car, and he'll highlight quite a bit of the Pontiac, but he's going to talk about the rest of the big three American performance in there. And so without further ado, let me introduce you to the godfather of the GTO, Jim Wanger.
Thank you, Dave. I'm not sure that I can live up to that kind of a heralded interview. But I certainly want to personally thank everybody who got up on a nice, crisp Saturday morning and came down to hear me tell some lies, tell some stories. Very rewarding scene to see such a nice turnout. I hope that I will make it worth your while. As Dave said, we're going to talk about the muscle car. A word really before we get into the presentation, maybe explaining this term, muscle car. When it was originally conceived, it was a very specific car. In a nutshell, basically, it was a new intermediate size car that had been brought into the U.S. market with an engine that had been designed and built for what we were then calling the full-size cars. And it wasn't, any kind of a magic miracle. It was very simply a matter of taking one engine and putting it into another car that was engineered for another engine. The one significant thing, however, and this is the most important thing I have to say relative to that action, is that every Pontiac V8 engine that was ever built, starting really with the very first ones in 1955, 287 cubic inches, all the way up to the very latest, the 455 cubic inch. The dimensions, the exterior dimensions on the block were always exactly the same. So it was not difficult to literally unzip a 326 cubic inch version of that engine from the then intermediate Tempest and stuff a 389 in there. It was a very simple case of taking one out and putting the other in. Every other muscle car, or cars that have assumed that nomenclature, whether it be a Chevrolet or an Oldsmobile or a Ford or a Mopar, all had two different engines, a small block and a big block. Consequently, it took them some serious engineering to develop what we call the muscle car, which was, as I said earlier, simply a matter of stuffing a bigger engine into an intermediate size car. Consequently, everybody took another year. Consequently, the GTO out in 1964 was an absolute exclusive. Not to admit that everybody else had one. You could buy an SS Chevelle. You could buy a 442, but it did not have the big engine. None of those competitors got their bigger engine until 1965, which is one of the reasons why being first is sometimes being the best. We knew that at the time and made it our absolute determined to stay in that position, to be first and consequently to be the best. And with that, I'm going to get started talking to you in what I call the anatomy of the muscle car, and all of the offsprings and cousins and grandchildren that came from having a muscle car. Now, what is a muscle car? And who really, in effect, built the first one? Well, a muscle car is a term, as I spent a few minutes just telling you. And needless to say, they all come from people. An old expression, I'm not the first one to ever say this: show me a winner, I'll show you a man or a woman. By the same token, show me a loser, and I'll show you a man or a woman. Hopefully. Here's a couple of folks that I was fortunate enough to have worked with in my career when we were active in bringing into the market and promoting into the market. And I don't want you to forget the word promotion, because that's really, in a sense, what many of these cars were all about. They were living, breathing, on the street examples of what we wanted the car nameplate to stand for. Zeroing in again on Pontiac, what we wanted was to build a performance image. And I'll say it as quickly and as aggressively and maybe even as hostily as I can. We wanted to beat a Chevrolet. And the GTO was certainly one of the tools that enabled us to do that. Now, to quickly identify some of the folks I'm going to run through, these are folks that I've had the good fortune of working with during my career in the auto industry. On the left, of course, we see Mr. Seaman E. Bunky Knudsen. Bunky was what we called a GM brat. He was literally grew up in a GM family. His father had been president of GM while Bunky was growing up. Bunky was a natural. So when the Pontiac division in the mid-1950s was in serious trouble, so serious that there was very, very serious thoughts of dropping the division. And let me tell you that in the mid-50s, it was a hell of a lot easier to drop a division than it would be today. But they, at the last moment, decided to send some new blood in there and see if they could kind of interject some excitement and perhaps save this thing. Thus, Mr. Knudsen. The gentleman on the right is Elliot M. Pete Estes, who at that time was the chief engineer at the Pontiac division. Fortunately for Pete, he was kind of a performance enthusiast, not a racer, but a performance enthusiast. Okay, here's a couple of fresh faces. I know everybody is going to be willing to go along with me as we are having a little bit of equipment trouble. The gentleman on the left here is Ed Cole, C-O-L-E. Ed turned out to be the chief engineer of the Chevrolet division right at that time, went on to become president of General Motors. One of Ed's greatest accomplishments is he is generally considered to be the father of the small block. Now, did I just make a huge statement? The father of the small block. And of course, as a result, he went on to become the president of General Motors. The gentleman on the right is a guy by the name of Vince Piggins. You may not recognize that, but Vince was God to anybody who was running in competition with a Chevrolet. Vince controlled the parts distribution, high-performance parts distribution, to anybody who was actively participating in any kind of motorsports with a Chevrolet. Here's a group folks that you may recognize that I was fortunate enough to work with. On the extreme left is David E. Davis, who at the time was the editor and publisher of Car and Driver magazine. Car and Driver, as you know, was the magazine that ran that infamous Pontiac GTO versus Ferrari GTO back in April of 1964, which did a tremendous amount to both promote the car and, I might add, the magazine. You recognize the next gentleman. That was when I was a much younger Jim Wangers and didn't have anywhere near as much hair as I have today. Again, on my left is a guy by the name of Bob Anderson, who at that time was head of the Plymouth division in the Chrysler Corporation. And Plymouth was beginning to be tough. They were coming into the marketplace with some pretty significant cars. This, of course, was a couple of years ahead of when they came in with the Roadrunner, which was perhaps the second most successful muscle car behind the GTO, I might add. On the right, of course, you all recognize what looks like maybe a college graduation picture of John DeLorean, as he was at that particular time. On the left is good old Shell, Carroll Shelby. I don't have to say very much about Shelby. He certainly did a magnificent job with the Cobra concept. He built some pretty exciting cars for Ford, even did a little work for Chrysler. Carroll is a legend. Carroll deserves to be a legend. One of the greatest contributors to stock car performance activities in the history of our industry. The gentleman on the right is named Tom Hoover. You may not recognize him at all. Tom is generally, in the right circles, considered to be the father of the Hemi. Tom was a Chrysler engineer and very, very involved with the development and the early production of that engine. Of course, all of us recognize the great Arcus Zara Dunn, Mr. Corvette, as he is rightfully and justifiably called. And here he is with one of the better examples of his favorite toys. Here's a couple of guys, one who I'm sure you recognize, Lee Iacocca, also a much younger picture, when the new Mustang was about to be launched. The gentleman on his left is named Don Fry. And in case, the best way I can describe Don Fry is that he was actually Iacocca's boss. Kind of hard to believe that Iacocca ever had a boss, but Don Fry was Lee's boss at that time. Of course, all of us remember the magnificent George Hurst. There he is with his very first Hurst Oldsmobile, the 1968 edition. The car was silver with black stripes. Of course, we all know one of the latter contributors, and still significant in our industry, Mr. Bob Lutz. So I'm through showing you some of the folks I met. Now we're going to get interested and start showing you some cars. Of course, we all recognize the early Deuce, the old 32, which was really, in a way, the first of the common, popularly priced, performance-oriented car. a Model A with a V8 engine. Ooh, boy. Of course, there had been some tremendous image builders. We don't have to go any further than the building we're in right now to see some living, breathing examples of these gorgeous Duesenbergs. Duesenberg was not only a car, it was an image. A car from which a term, boy, that's a doozy, has become part of our English language. Okay, we're now right after World War II, when the introduction of the production, because there had been many before that, the production overhead valve V8 showed up at General Motors in the form of the Olds rocket. It was called the Kettering V8 engine. It was also in the 49 Cadillacs. That was the first of the production overhead valve V8 engines. Now, it didn't necessarily take a V8 engine at that time to show performance. Here we see a couple of what were called, and rightly so, the fabulous Hudson Hornet. A 308 cubic inch flathead 6, an inline 6, an old style flathead 6, just drunk with torque. It happened to be one of the most capable professional stock car racers in the early days of NASCAR. And it got to the point where the car actually was called. People that owned the car said, oh, I've got one of those fabulous Hudson Hornets. The word fabulous kind of went right along with the name Hudson Hornet. They featured 2 carburetors, and they even had smart marketing effort on that. It was called Twin H Power. Now remember, this was an old flathead 6-cylinder inline, but it was doing a job. And it went along with the very, very early development of NASCAR, which is, of course, professional stock car racing. It wasn't long before everybody, however, jumped into the overhead valve V8. Here we see an early 50s Lincoln. Here we see that early 50s Lincoln in competition, what was then called the Pan American Road Race, which is today the Mexican Road Race. A magnificent and a tough struggle for anybody participating, and Lincoln was the first manufacturer to actually, as a manufacturer, get into competition in that activity. And it worked for them. Introducing the new overhead valve V8 from the Ford Motor Company, and at the same time talking about durability and reliability and toughness for a car called Lincoln, which was at that time undergoing a major personality change. Even Studebaker saw fit to get into the overhead valve V8. Their first V8, a 232 cubic inch, which looked every bit like the famed Olds rocket. It even had 7 main bearings, for those of you who care. It went from 232 to 259 to 289 and kept Studebaker around in the car business for perhaps another decade before they too would finally stumble. And then, of course, came King Kong, which is a kind of a nice name for the early Chrysler Hemis. 180 horsepower. Well, in 1950s, that was a pretty significant number. And it was called Firepower, for those of you who might remember. And the DeSoto version was called Fire Dome. The Hemi V8, commonly probably the most sophisticated of those type of high compression V8 engines. Good indeed for racing, not necessarily so good for general driving. And I remember an experience I had personally one day. I was in the height of Chrysler promoting this new Hemi V8. I stopped one of my friends in the Pontiac engineering department. I says, what does Chrysler know about the Hemi that we don't know? He says, well, as a matter of fact, I don't think they know enough about it because we know to stay away from it. And of course, what he was talking about was reliability, dependability as a daily driver. Now let's talk a bit about how those first big overhead valve V8 engines were promoted. We like to think that the GTO was in effect the first muscle car, and it is, and rightfully so, and should continue to be. But the first packaged V8 that was given a car with a name happened in 1955 when Chrysler introduced their famed 300, which was a result of the engine that was in that car. Not very long after that, the entire Chrysler line became significantly part of that new Chrysler imaging. Here we see the great 57 Plymouth Fury, the DeSoto Adventurer with the Fire Dome V8 engine instead of the Fire Power. Even American Motors saw fit to jump in a little bit to the performance revolution. This is a 1957 Rambler Rebel. And believe it or not, if you could stand to look at it, it was actually a pretty good running vehicle. But it was really in 1955 when this whole new generation kind of caught on with the unforgettable, the most recognized, and perhaps the most saluted of all of these early American performance cars, the great 55 Motoramic Chevrolet, that introduced what we all have come to know and love, maybe hate if you run a Ford or a Chrysler or a Pontiac, the small block Chevy, which reached its peak in those early 50s, those mid-50s, with the great 57 Chevy, which in 1957 was considered, gee, you know, that's nothing but kind of a carryover of the 55s and the 56s, while the new Ford was a brand new car. And of course, we all know that the new Chrysler stuff, particularly the Plymouth, was all brand new. Well, you don't need me to tell you what's happened to the value and the respect and the collectability of those 57 cars. Compare that Ford or that Plymouth to the 57 Chevy, and it doesn't stand up very well. Well, in 1957, along came a car called Pontiac with a 287 cubic inch V8. Well, everybody said that's nothing but a big Chevy. You don't really need to go look at a Pontiac. You can buy it in a Chevy. It's a little smaller, but the car's a little lighter, and it's going to run every bit as good. So Pontiac in 1955, with an all-new car and an all-new V8 engine, flunked. And after the disastrous 1956, with that same equipment, the corporation then made the decision that we're either going to have to turn this thing around with some new people or we're going to have to drop it. So it was after the new car and after the new engine that Pontiac still remained a problem. There it is. You know, what do you say after it's got a nice wraparound windshield and a few stars floating around and a hood ornament that lit up, and oh boy, what else? You know, well, it's a nice car. But that wasn't enough. GM knew it, Pontiac knew it. Something had to be done. And something was done. It started under the hood when that 287 cubic inch went to 316 and then to 347. In 1957, a 57 Pontiac Chieftain startled the automotive world by winning both the standing quarter mile and the flying mile at the Daytona 500 Speed Week activities in Daytona. Here we see that 57 Pontiac in action on the sands of Daytona Beach. 1957 was also the year that Pontiac decided to chrome up, if I may use that expression. And other than the criticism, justifiably, that the front end looked like an exploded view of a Remington electric shaver, and if you look at it real closely, it still does. It wasn't too bad a car, especially with that 347 cubic inch engine. But more importantly than anything else, in 1957 came along a car called Bonneville. which was later to become the crown prince of the Pontiac line. And here it is in its beautiful chromed up package that was presented in 1957, but under that hood was a pretty capable performer. By 1959 and 1960, Pontiac was already aggressively involved in motorsports, aggressively involved in competition, not only on the stock car tracks, but also on the drag strips. And along came the great 421, and then the 421 Super Duty engine. Pontiac was engaged in racing full time, and it was working. Here we see it in action at several drag strips all over the country. In 1963, Pontiac built a completely devoted, purpose-built car for drag racing. It was a Catalina that was called the Swiss cheese. Without boring you, I'll tell you why it was called the Swiss cheese. Because there were 2-inch holes drilled down both side rails of the frame in an attempt to lighten the weight on the car. Now it did lighten the weight. In fact, when you got a good launch, the car and the tires worked, the car actually shrunk. The frame bent and the wheelbase shrunk, and it came out of the line almost like a catapult. Well, as you can also imagine, that only lasted maybe a month before every one of them broke. The frames, that is. But the famed 63 Pontiac Swiss cheese, which is now come to be called, is called Swiss cheese because of those holes that were drilled in the side rails of the frame. Pontiac, at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, was doing extremely well with NASCAR. Here we see the 62 Pontiac, driven by famed racer Fireball Roberts, winning the Daytona 500 in 1962. Unfortunately, that was the same year that General Motors decided, after getting some pressure, and I'll talk a minute about that, from the U.S. government, decided to pull back out of organized motorsports. Pontiac was building at that time not only some serious race cars, but some pretty good-looking passenger cars. This was the first year, for example, for the great Grand Prix. General Motors had decided, after the government tapped them on the shoulder one afternoon and said, you know, you guys are getting about 55% of the new car market. Let me add now that this was before we ever saw any kind of production Toyotas or Nissans or Hondas. We were getting a few Jaguars in, we were getting a few Mercedes. The Japanese had not become a factor. And consequently, the American automakers enjoyed pretty much their own way in the U.S. car market. And General Motors was getting a little over 55% of that. Well, the Federal Trade Commission tapped them on the shoulder one day and said, we're watching you. And if you should ever get close to 60% of the market, we're going to have to break it up. Well, in itself, that is such a dumb statement if you really organized and understood what General Motors was all about and how they were so intermingled, building the same car in different plants and building different cars in the same plants. But it was a threat, and GM management took it seriously, and so the first thing they said was, let's stop selling cars to young people. Can you imagine that? In the early 1960s, that was what GM's management answer to the corporation was. Now, this was at a period when all these wonderful new cars were coming into the market. The great 409s, the old Starfire, Ford's beautiful Galaxy, those lightweight Dodge and Plymouths with the big Hemi engines. If you could stand to look at them, you could sure enjoy them. The great Buick Riviera, one of the greatest looking cars of all time. Even Buick got into the performance arena with their Wildcat. And of course, we all remember the 427 Chevy. This innocent-looking Impala was nothing to fool with if you were out street racing. All of that was over. No more. No more active participation or sponsorship of any professional motorsports. And that was the way the dictate looked down from the top level at the General Motors Corporation. Well, at this very same time, GM had begun to build some really interesting intermediate cars. Now, you'll notice I've avoided the word compact because these were not compacts. The compacts, such as the Corvair or the Ford Falcon, were already in the market for 10 years. But along came the Pontiac Tempest, the small Olds, the small Buick, even the small Chevrolet called the Chevelle, an intermediate-sized car designed first for economy, but now suddenly opened up the opportunity to stick a bigger engine. Now, that's not brain surgery. The aftermarket had been doing it for years. What did Pontiac do? Well, they were the first manufacturer, original equipment manufacturer, to decide to do it at the factory. And not let the aftermarket do it, but take a bigger engine, a bigger Pontiac engine, and stuff it into a smaller car. And here is the guy who really fostered that decision. At the time, John DeLorean was the chief engineer of the Pontiac division. And it was under DeLorean's management that a couple of his very capable assistants, by name a chap named Bill Collins, who was in charge of chassis development, and a chap named Russ G., who was in charge of engine development, came to John and said, John, you know, we could take a 389 and stick it in this Tempest, which is designed to carry a 326, in a matter of about a half an hour, because the motor mounts are exactly the same. John looked at both of them with kind of aggressive twinkles in their eye, and he said, do it. And that is, in effect, the birth action, the birth date of one of the more famous muscle cars, one of our more favorite muscle cars, the great 64 Pontiac GTO. Car and Driver magazine was quick to catch on. Here we see an old beat-up version of their cover. And I don't know if you can read that very top line. We were calling it then, believe it or not, a Tempest GTO. Tempest GTO, 0 to 100 in 11.8 seconds. Let me tell you that car wouldn't run 0 to 100 in 11.8 seconds, dropping right off the top of the Empire State Building. But I wasn't going to argue with him. And of course, right after the car got out came all of the other promotions. A wonderful song, which I'm proud, or which I'm privileged, or which I'm humbled to say I had nothing to do with. The song came out. We jumped on it, of course, after it came out, and made sure that wherever we could get plays of that on the radio. And along came a whole bunch of the other side promotions. There was a cologne called GTO. There was a dance called Wide Trackin' that talked about a GTO. And of course, we then began to call our car a Tiger. I'm going to take a minute to talk about the Tiger. You know, the big high-powered advertising folks, we were going to get this car kind of imaged as a Tiger. Well, in the meantime, the young folks that bought the car had a hell of a time understanding, or even taking a few minutes to find out what the term Gran Turismo Omologato stood for, which very quickly, if you don't know, is Grand Touring Homologated in English, which stands really for a big engine in a smaller car, all built by the same manufacturer. That's what the homologated means, that it was a Pontiac engine in a Pontiac car, though that wasn't the way they were originally designed or conceived. Well, when that happened, of course, the name GTO and the idea of calling it a Tiger sounded awfully good to us. And so we began, as the marketers and promoters, to try to call this car a Tiger. As I said earlier, the young folks that owned the cars originally didn't want to slow down and try to find out what Gran Turismo Omologato meant. So they took the first English word that came the closest to using the letters GTO. That turned out to be goat. And in spite of our high-powered advertising and all our serious marketing experts, the car still remains a goat. Which in a way is kind of nice. You know, and if you want to get fancy, you call it a Tiger, as we tried to, but it stuck as a goat. Here we see a special promotion package that was created by a very active dealer in the Detroit area, Royal Pontiac. They created a special performance package, which was no more than any kind of a hot rod tune-up that anybody would apply. You know, richer jets, less restrictive air cleaner, give it a quicker distributor advance curve, maybe stick a set of headers on it, put a low restriction air cleaner, all of the tricks that anybody was doing in those days. This was before the EPA, when you could raise the hood in the dealership and touch something. And as a result, you know, the Bobcat concept really caught on. And one of the more romantic aspects of that whole car and the tuning procedures that came about were the tri-power configuration, the 3 2-barrel carburetors. We were very quickly able to outperform the 3 2-barrel carburetors with a big 4-barrel in 1967. But let me tell you that from a marketing standpoint, losing the tri-power, losing the image value, pulling into a gas station and saying very nonchalantly to the attendant, in those days we weren't self-serving, "Check my oil, would you please?" And they'd go over and raise the hood and everybody'd say, "Oh, wow." And here was those 3 2-barrel carburetors sitting up there that looked so sophisticated and so mean. There they are. The GTO Tiger, when it became a major promotion from Pontiac, in the meantime, as I said, the owners of the car were very satisfied to continue to call it a goat. Now, all kinds of things happened when we were promoting the Tiger. I'm going to take you into tell you a little incident which was never photographed, which is why I have to show it to you in a rendering. Using a Tiger, as we did very aggressively in our television marketing, was not as easy as it might sound. We were told that these Tigers that we were renting from this special service were tamed and that they should not be concerned. Only the one thing they did always say, don't ever turn your back on one. Well, we had one particular scene where there was this nice tan GTO coupe. The door was open, and the Tiger was supposed to come up, paused before he jumped in the car, was to sit as anybody would sit after he jumped in, and put his paws up on the steering wheel. Very simple procedure, and they had trained the Tiger, the professionals who were there. So we were all standing way too close when this Tigress, I might add, it was a lady Tiger, came up to the car and paused as she was supposed to do. And then when the command to enter or to jump into the car was given, she didn't move. Well, nobody thought too much about that at the beginning, so they gave it to her again, jump into the Tiger. She didn't move. At which point they turned to everybody who was already way too close and they said, "Get out of here. Get out of here as quickly and as fast as you can." And so we all picked up, cameras included, and ran. In the meantime, that very tame Tiger jumped into that car and proceeded to devour it. And I use that word in every bit of its imagination possible. There wasn't anything left. She chewed up the steering wheel, the instrument panel, the carpets, the sun visors, the floor mats. There wasn't anything that she didn't try to take a bite out of. The only thing, incidentally, that she wasn't successful was the steering wheel. Never could get that apart. But that was an experience, needless to say, which was hard to forget, that I personally saw. So working with a Tiger, even though it was, kind of second and third removed, had its excitement. Tie-in promotions were wonderful. Opportunities never, ever were better. Here we see, for example, the big men's shoe of the 60s, the Tom McCann shoe. They brought out a shoe aimed primarily at teenagers called the GTO. They called it the world's first high-performance shoe. And if you'll notice, it had a beveled heel on it so that you could get a better grip on the accelerator pedal. Now, this was aimed at the 12 and 13-year-olds, who were getting better grips on the accelerator pedal. On the instep was sewn in a beautiful GTO symbol. And it was an extremely popular, and one of the things that made it so sophisticated and so great for Pontiac is that at that time, Tom McCann was the leading male shoe manufacturer in the United States. And they were the number one shoe manufacturer using television as well as radio. And so we were able to get the name GTO exposed on television and on radio. And this was at a time when the corporation had told us, as I mentioned before, back off a little bit. We don't want to hear a whole lot of promotion about performance. We don't want to hear screeching tires. We don't want to hear any more loud exhaust. Back off on that. Stop selling cars to young people. And so we asked Tom McCann to do it for us. And they did. And I know they did because we used to get a complaint a week from somebody at the top of General Motors. "I thought we asked you to stop screeching those tires and screaming those engines." And of course, those were Tom McCann commercials promoting shoes. And we very, politely and honestly said, "Gee, that's not our stuff, It worked. We were even getting, as I say, a little bit aggressive, a little smug, maybe a little too braggy. Here we see, for example, a 66 ad where we say to all of their cars from the GTO, "What's new, pussycats?" Kind of a hostile, smug, aggressive ad. We were calling them now the wide track Tigers, which was taking advantage of this new wide track concept and tying it into the Tiger. Here we see a rendering that was created out of the Pontiac styling department when we were given the opportunity to tie in with a new television show that was going together featuring the Monkey Mobiles. The monkey, not the Monkey Mobiles. The monkeys were going to have their own television show and they were going to have their own car. And after a whole lot of aggressive, soul searching as well as dollars changing hands, we were able to get that car to be a GTO. The Monkey Mobile, the monkey's car, one of the hottest young groups in the country, were going to be driving a GTO. And this is the sketch that was produced by the Pontiac Styling Studio and submitted to a guy by the name of Dean Jeffries, who was a car customizer out of Los Angeles and had been awarded the contract to build the Monkey Mobile. This is what we wanted it to look like. This is what it turned out to be. As you can imagine, it was a very embarrassing moment for Jim Wangers. Nobody at Pontiac was willing to understand that this was representative of their very, very, very famous car, the GTO. However, it went on to become a very significant promotion, as the Monkees' sponsors on television was the Kellogg Corporation. They promoted a huge big contest on the backs of 42 million boxes of Rice Krispies and Raisin Bran. And they promised us, based on their research, that a box of cereal came off the pantry shelf and was placed on the breakfast table or the lunch table 6 times before it was emptied. And so we figured that's a pretty significant exposure. So we tied in with them. The winning contestant, who only had to write in 25 words or less why I'd like to drive a Pontiac GTO, they were given a chance to come to Hollywood, appear in an episode of The Monkees, and then we gave 15 GTO convertibles to the next 15 prize winners. It was a very, very well paid off contest, and a very, very successful contest. Now, one of the things we did in the conjunction with that contest is that in the ad and in the back of the cereal box, as you see here, we ran this picture of a GTO convertible. Now, this was in March of 1967. And the 68 GTO had not even been seen by the dealers yet. And yet we ran this car on the backs of 42 million boxes of cereals. Most everybody looked at it and said, gee, that's not a GTO that I know. Maybe it's some sort of a custom or some kind of a special thing. You'll notice also that the Monkey Mobile did not make the box of cereals. That much I was able to see to. Well, what we had on here was the 1968 GTO that didn't come out into the marketplace until October of 1967. Here it was on 42 million boxes of Kelloggs cereal in March of 67, which turned out to be a great promotion. And as a result, we introduced the new 68 car in that very same red convertible. That's the announcement ad that we showed the first time we showed the new 68, which also, as you may know, introduced the famed soft nose or Endura bumper, which was at the time capable of repairing itself. If it got a relatively small nick from maybe in parking or something, you could sit there and in about a half an hour it would disappear. Well, it worked most of the time. And of course, as the muscle car began to get more sophisticated, along came a lot more special models. Here we see the famed Judge, which is in itself almost a special car out of a special car. The GTO was introduced to help promote the Le Mans. The Judge was introduced to help promote the GTO. Consequently, the ads, all of the exposure that we did on that car was successful in building an image, not necessarily for the GTO, but for the Judge. As you can appreciate, the law community in this country did not like this ad. And it wasn't a matter of a month before they came to General Motors and insisted that Pontiac drop it. As you might appreciate, we did. Everybody else wasn't going to sleep, as I said, during that time. Here we see an excellent effort from Chevrolet. All kinds of developments at Chevrolet that led to significant improvements and to very, very, very important cars. Remember that one, because I'll come back and talk a little bit about it. Oldsmobile was certainly not asleep as they improved their 442. Hurst George Hurst himself, who always wanted to build a car with the name Hearst on it, finally was able to get together with Oldsmobile. In 1968, they brought out this first Hurst Olds, a silver and black effort, which had a 455 cubic inch engine in it. Now, we were lucky to be able to get a 400 cubic inch engine in those muscle cars, in those intermediate cars. Here was Hearst putting 455s in those special Oldsmobiles. In '69, the Hurst Oldsmobile became significantly popular as it was in white and gold with a very unusual hood scoop on it. Oldsmobile continued to be a significant player, as was Plymouth, who first got into the market with the GTX and their sister division Dodge with the Coronet RT. In 1968, they hit a home run and a half with the first Roadrunner, which happened to be an extremely well-conceived and well-marketed promotion. They promoted the car as a price leader with a 383 cubic inch engine, and yet floor mats and hubcaps and bench seats. You could buy this car that was a capable muscle car for a relatively low price. Well, it got to be so significant that we got worried about it at Pontiac. And so we researched it, only to learn that the car they were selling in the dealership, the average Roadrunner package, had a set of full wheel covers, bucket seats, 4-speed on the floor, multiple carburation, and all of the features that went into making it a muscle car. And that the image they had built of it being a low-priced, high-performance package, while it was bringing people into the showroom, it was not the car they were selling. Dodge, of course, jumped into the same realm, doing some very nice work with their Charger. Dodge and Plymouth both brought out a very special package to participate in NASCAR. These cars were so fantastic and performed so well in competition down in Daytona that they were disqualified. And they were only disqualified because the rest of the manufacturers, most notably the Ford Motor Company, said we won't participate against them with our production cars if you allow them to run that special front end. Chrysler went on to build 500 examples of these cars in order to qualify, many of them with 318 cubic inch engines, which were not exactly in keeping with the aggressive styling. The cars were an absolute drug on the market, as you might appreciate, when they were new cars. Anybody who's involved with the collector world, I'm sure, knows today what they're worth, regardless of what engine is in them. These guys never got it. They never understood the muscle car. The Fairlane GTA, as they marketed it, was a 390 cubic inch Ford Fairlane. The 390 was not a particularly sophisticated version. It was hydraulic lifter. It came only with an automatic transmission, which is what the A stands for on the GT. They even ran this kind of advertising, which, needless to say, absolutely broke us up at Pontiac, because you wouldn't win this race in an ad. So unfortunately, the Ford muscle car era was really not very competitive. Buick, on the other hand, proceeded to get right in the middle of the fray, bringing out some very special Grand Sports. This one in particular, and I want you to remember this because I'm going to talk a little bit about it later, was a very, very significant car. In 1970, they introduced an all-new, full aluminum 455 cubic inch high compression V8. And let me tell you that it beat somebody. And unfortunately, in 1971, General Motors decided, in cooperation with the government, to cut compression, in case many of you may or may not remember. And all GM cars in 1971 had 7.6 to 1 compression, which obviously did not help high performance. Now, some of the manufacturers went to work and did some camshaft timing development and were able to make those lower compression cars more competitive. Unfortunately, Buick was not one of them. Even American Motors got into the costume muscle car. This car was called the Scrambler. They only built 2,500 of them because they were afraid that it would not be well received. Well, it was ridiculously well received. It had a 390 cubic inch V8 in what was the lightest of all of the muscle cars available. The paint job on it was in time and in tune with what was going on in the marketplace. And to their credit, they sold it well, but unfortunately never built it again. The next year, they followed it up with a version of their Rebel, which they called the Machine. You don't have to look very long at it to figure out why it did not sell. Now, of course, we came into another generation of cars that were coming along at that time, the true American sports car. All right, those were muscle car cousins too. Here we see the first of the American production sports car, the '53 Corvette. I'm sure most of you have seen one of these. If you ever really get up close to them, you'll see how crude in many ways they were, how poorly fitting the panels were, but they were a production car. By 1965, they put the small block V8 in it, and it suddenly became something worthwhile. 1963, they introduced the new styling with the famed split window feature. Unfortunately, only carried that for 1 year, and as most of you know, what collector value those 63 fastback Vettes have. As it grew up, it became a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more pedestrian, but still the only true American sports car. As it matured, it became even more sophisticated. An old manufacturer called Kaiser Frazer got into the sports car packaging way back in 1954 with a cute little fiberglass version of a car they built off of their, what they called the Henry J, which was a small, kind of a compact sized car, and they created this all fiberglass sports car body. They only built 600 of those, and as you might appreciate, they do have some collector value. Ford decided to jump into the two-passenger market segment, the sports car market per se, in 1955 with a beautifully executed car called Thunderbird. By 1957, it had become extremely sophisticated, but also extremely limited. The U.S. car market did not like two-passenger cars. They wanted their cars to look sporty and be sporty, but they wanted a back seat. So as we all know, Ford changed in 1958, and by 1959 they were building a pretty good example of what has turned out to be the luxury sport coupe, rather than just a performance-oriented sport coupe. American Motors jumped into the fray with their pony car called Javelin, built a two-place version of it and called it the AMX. A nice effort, but unfortunately a little bit too little, a little bit too late. Pontiac, as late as in the 1980s, was given the opportunity one more time to get into the sports car market. I'm not sure there's much more that I can say about this car. Now we go into the pony cars themselves, another generation of performance cars, muscle car cousins. They're called pony cars because they're named after the first entrant in the field, the famous, fabulous, unbelievably successful '64 Ford Mustang, introduced April 17th, 1964, with a price tag of $2,364, and that included a big 6-cylinder engine. Well, it didn't last very long as a 6, but it certainly did as a car. And as Mustang matured and improved, so did the whole segment, led by this car for which the segment was named, the Great Ford Mustang. Their sister division, Mercury, was given a car called Cougar, which was in effect kind of a chrome-plated Mustang, as it should have been. That's what a Mercury was all about. And while they were building pretty good versions of the Mustang called Cougars, they were successful. It took General Motors over 3 years, 1967, to finally answer the success of that Mustang, that pony car, as we have called it, because of the Mustang itself, with the first Camaro. Now, Chevrolet grew up pretty fast with their second generation Camaro, which turned out to be a huge success. And of course, as we all know, Pontiac was right there, right alongside of Chevrolet. John DeLorean himself went to the corporation and said, I'm going to be forced to build a version of the Chevy Camaro. We're going to call it Firebird. But he said, the last thing I'm going to do is build a Pontiac with a Chevrolet engine in it. And unless you allow me to put my 400 cubic inch engine in this car, I will refuse to build it. Now, that's the kind of statement that a John DeLorean in 1967 could make. Pontiac had been so successful. And as a matter of fact, in 1965 and 1966 were the leading profit division in the entire General Motors lineup. DeLorean knew that, and he knew that he could make some demands. Well, his demands worked. And as a result, when the Pontiac Firebird came out in 1967, they did in fact introduce the fabulous Firebird 400. Which was a 400 cubic inch engine in that relatively lightweight pony car. In 1969, when it came time to do some special versions of these special cars, the Z28 appeared for Chevrolet, the Trans Am appeared for Pontiac. And while the 69 Trans Am may have only been more of a costume with modest suspension changes, the introduction of the Ram Air 3 and the Ram Air 4 engines, which were available in any Firebird, the fact were that they only built a little over 690 of these. And today they have, as you might appreciate, incredible collector value. The Pontiac Firebird was restyled in 1970. It released only in 2 colors, blue with white and white with blue. It was the first year they introduced the great cowl induction system with the air filter and the air cleaner and the air intake actually facing towards the rear of the car, as you see it here, to take advantage of the swirling effort that the air would go into after collecting on the windshield. It modestly worked, but it certainly was good-looking and exclusive from a design standpoint. By the late 1970s, Pontiac Firebird had become a very, very significant high-imaged performance car. Here we see a car known as the Bandit, which, as most of you know, was named for the film, the Smokey and the Bandit film, which, of course, introduced Burt Reynolds and Sally Field. Here we see the car dressed up in its action. Turned out to be one of, if not the best automotive placement in any major film or television effort. I will get some arguments on that subject when I'm talking to folks about General Lee and its strength and its value of its appearance. And I quickly remind them that the General Lee was a 1969 Dodge Charger, and that the movie it was promoted in and the series it promoted in was 1982. And Dodge wasn't selling 69 Chargers in 1982, whereas we were selling new black and gold Trans Ams in 1977 and 1978. Of course, the specialty package reached down into some of the smaller cars. Chrysler hit a real home run when they brought in the 340 cubic inch engine in their new Duster, which was an answer in a way to the Mustang and the Camaro and the Firebird. The Challenger became a real true pony car with an awfully good looking body. The Cuda, the best of which was called the Hemi Cuda, came into its own specifically for performance and taking advantage of the history that the Hemi engine had built. And that brings us into the last chapter of American performance cars, which I call the muscle car offerings of the day. Now, while Ford didn't understand it in the 60s, they sure got it in the 70s and in the 80s, because the 5.0 Mustang literally became an all-new image for sporty performance Fords. A 5.0 was in itself every bit, if not more popular than our beloved GTO was in the 60s. And it had the same kind of charisma. It was kind of the bad boy's car. Buick came back with their Grand National, a turbocharged six-cylinder engine, which performance exceeded anybody's predictions. Pontiac borrowed that engine in the late 80s, in 1989, and introduced what was probably the best second-generation Firebird ever built, the Turbo Trans Am, with that Buick V6 engine, turbo-equipped. The new style on those pony cars, which appeared right after the turn of the decade. Here we see it as the 01 Trans Am and the 02 Camaro, rejuvenated that whole market segment. God, those cars were good looking, everybody said. Dodge brought in another version of King Kong, but unfortunately priced way too high and not built quite up to the quality standards that it should have for its price. But it sure did perform. Trucks became an important part of the performance world. Here we see the Dodge SR-10, another half-ton pickup. Here we see one coming in from Ford, which was called the SVT Lightning, a big performance engine in a pickup truck. Chevrolet had the SS Silverado. Chrysler then went into performance with a four-door, the SRT-8, which they're still building. Great big old heavy four-door with a big package in it. Dodge followed up and even put performance in their new wagon when they introduced the Magnum. Then came the Dodge four-door, the Charger, all under the term SRT, which stood for performance. The Challenger was restyled and became another SRT. Pontiac I'm not sure that there's anything more I can say about that you already know. The G8, on the other hand, became a serious car, well marketed, well promoted, well built. Unfortunately, a little bit too late. A little bit too late for the time. Of course, Chevrolet and its fabulous Corvette, and the greatest of the Corvettes, the new Z06 package. Hard to even give it a second thought without saying, oh my God. Cadillac became a performance symbol again at General Motors with their CTS-V package. And when they introduced the CTS-V Coupe with twin turbochargers, oh my God was the answer. Even a station wagon was available on the CTS with a performance package. And of course, when they introduced it with a twin turbo, everybody said, my God, is Cadillac kind of take over the performance world. Ford, of course, with one more Shelby. And if I have a criticism for Ford, it's unfortunate that they have built one too many different Shelbys. And most everybody thinks of a Shelby as a fairly sophisticated Ford Mustang, but they have absolutely no idea which one they're talking about. And while it's a beautiful car and it's a very, very significant name, it's time to separate them, because there's total confusion out there. The Mustang GT, on the other hand, was a huge success. I think that's the best that I can say about this. Unfortunately, a little bit too little, a little bit too late. Camaro, on the other hand, came back big. The new Camaro became a strong statement for General Motors, and of course the fabulous ZR1. How could you overlook a strong package like that from General Motors? Ford went back into the full-size car and built in some serious performance. And here, of course, is a kind of a bit of a stab at an old automotive expression. Henry Ford was supposed to have said, you can have it in any color as long as you want it in black. Unfortunately, today, GM, Ford, Chrysler, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota will all say to you, you can have it in any color as long as it's green. And unfortunately, that is so true. And there's no better example than this wonderful package coming out of Buick with a 6-cylinder in it. Or this little thing that Chrysler is bringing over from Fiat. Small, cute, pretty quick. And of course, the Focus with their ST package, and Chevrolet with the new SS Impala, first introduced as a race car and then as a production family car. The Chevrolet Supersport, in a sense, a high-performance family sedan. Tesla, we all know them. They certainly are a big news feature everywhere, and particularly in this area. They have by no means forgotten the performance value of an electric motor. And they are, without any question, delivering for the dollar a pretty competitive performance car. Even the Fisker, while it now belongs to the Chinese, is a factor to be reckoned with. The Chinese, as we all know, have been trying to get into the U.S. market for years. This may just be their ticket. And as a result, I have to answer the question now to you, what was the fastest showroom stock muscle car? Well, I told you to remember the Chevelle SS 454. I told you to remember that great 70 Buick Grand Sport. I didn't talk too much because it wasn't really known as a muscle car about the 65 Plymouth, the Belvedere, and the Dodge Coronet with the early 426 Hemi. But the facts were, and most of the experts, most of the magazine writers that I have chatted with will all agree that from a pure acceleration standpoint, from a 0 to 60 or from a quarter mile, the 65 Plymouth Belvedere 426 Hemi was the quickest American production car ever built. And with that as a thought, I often get told by several of the folks that I talk to, they sure don't make them like they used to. My answer to that is, thank God. On the other hand, they're all muscle cars. No matter what size, no matter what shape, whether it's a truck or a four-door or a sporty convertible, they're all muscle cars and they deserve the recognition. And so the idea of calling a specific thing a muscle car and a sporty car and a full-size car, that's passé. Any car that purports to have performance is, in fact, a muscle car. And with that, I want to say to you all, thank you for being a marvelous audience. I enjoyed talking to you. You have been a wonderfully receptive group. Thank you again for inviting me.
So what we like to do at this part is we got 6 questions we're going to ask Jim. And then, if Jim's up for it, we'll open up the floor for some Q&A. We put together 6 questions we asked each of the speakers just to get a little bit further insight to their car passion. So, Jim, there's an enclosed transporter outside, and you can take it around the world, back in history. What are your top 5 favorite cars of all time?
Well, you know they're going to be all Pontiacs.
They can be whatever you want them to be.
But I got to tell you that my absolute most favorite Pontiac is the 69 Judge. Not only a 69 Judge, but a 69 Judge with a Ram Air 4 4-speed in carousel red. That's predictable.
Number 1.
Number 2, I sort of like the very, very first Pontiac Grand Prix, the 1962 Grand Prix, which many of you may not remember. It was actually, and there's a funny story that goes with it, which I'll be happy to share with you. General Motors was very concerned about the success of the 4-passenger Thunderbird in the late 50s. So they went to Cadillac and said, we want a competitive car in the marketplace by 1960. If you remember, the Thunderbird went to a 4th place in 1958. So Cadillac went to work and put together a very, very nice package. Well, in 1959 and 1960, Cadillac was having some unusual success selling their DeVille models. The Coupe DeVille, even the convertible was doing extremely well. And so when they brought this special car back to General Motors, they said, here's the car, but we don't really want to build it. And here's why. Because they didn't want to get in the way of what they were enjoying with the success of their regular DeVille series. GM agreed. And so GM then called in Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick, showed them this car that Cadillac had done, and said, okay, you got 30 days to put a presentation together as to what you will do with this car and how it'll work better for you at Pontiac, you at Olds, or you at Buick. Come back in 30 days and we will make the decision as to who will have the car. Well, a guy by the name of Bunky Knudsen, who I described to you earlier, was running Pontiac at that time. He was smart enough to know that Pontiac was never going to get that car because they didn't need it. And so while he issued the direction to his marketing department to come back with a presentation as to what they would do with this very special car that Cadillac had developed, he then in turn talked to his engineering and his design department. And he said, I want a luxury sport coupe in the marketplace by 1962. And don't worry about this car that's supposedly coming in from Cadillac. We'll never get it, but we're going to beat them into the marketplace. And so they went to work on a Catalina for 1962 and brought it out as the Grand Prix. The car that I talked to you about that Cadillac had developed was given ultimately to Buick and came out in 1963 as the Buick Riviera, which, while it was in itself a very significant car, it never caught the Pontiac Grand Prix in sales and marketing acceptance after that time.
You got 3 spaces left on your truck.
How much time do you have?
And we got some more questions. So,
well,
the next 3, we know they're going to be Pontiacs. So,
I didn't get the last.
You got 3 more cars to put on your truck, your favorite.
My 5 favorites.
You got to make your top 5 favorite.
Well, needless to say, the first Firebird was a marvelous statement. I was very involved in that because when Mr. Knudsen turned to his marketing guys and asked them to put together a presentation as to what they would do with that car, I was asked to write the presentation. And so when we were invited to come down and make the presentation to the corporation to justify why we had done this special car called GTO, we already had 15,000 new dealer orders for the car. And so when we went down to present to the corporation why we had done it, we also showed them the 15,000 new orders, at which point they said, case closed. They turned right to Chevrolet and Olds and Buick and said, you can build one too. And so that's how the muscle car, in a sense, got started.
Okay. And do you want to fill the truck? Do you want to fill the transporter with your top 5?
Okay, I got one more to put in there.
You got one more.
All right. I am a tremendous supporter of the front end on the 67 full-size Pontiac. That was one of the cars where they integrated the styling of the headlights and the bumper. It was the last year for the chrome-plated bumper. But the integration into the styling of the headlights and that bumper was just magnificent. And I have always looked at it as one of my absolute favorite front-end designs on any American car.
Okay. So you're in your transporter and you're driving across the plains, you're driving across the desert, and it stops. It's broken down. You got to take one of these 5 cars and continue. And you can't go back for any other ones. So now of your top 5, which is the one you're going to choose?
Without any question, the 1969 Carousel Red Judge.
Okay.
And yes,
I think we probably know the answer to the next question. What car would you like to drive coast to coast? Now, that could be a leisurely drive along Route 66, or it could be a cannonball run style. Do we know the answer?
Oh, yeah. And that, you know, if you had any brains in your head, you'd want to pick an automatic. But I wouldn't. I would jump right back in that great 69 Judge. And one of the reasons is that nowhere where I went with it, somebody would stop and ask me, what is it? Who the hell would paint a car that color? And where did they get the idea for that ridiculous spoiler sitting up on the rear deck? All of those things which are today kind of so whats, they were big things in those days. And I'm lucky enough to have been there to remember that.
Jim, our 4th question. If you could, which automotive person from history would you like to meet, whether over lunch or to go for a ride with?
I personally have a kind of a personal, what if idea about a guy named Walter Chrysler. Chrysler came up, as a matter of fact, through General Motors. He was the general manager of the Buick division when it rose to become a fairly significant car. But to leave the security of General Motors and jump in and start his own company, which was a result of a purchase of some already failed American cars, one called Chalmers, and form the Chrysler Corporation, and then be smart enough and big enough to buy this gigantic success called the Dodge Brothers. Took a guy with some real perseverance and real conviction. And I would personally love to spend some time with Walter Chrysler.
That would be quite a conversation. Which automotive venue or event around the world would you like to attend or participate in?
I must confess that I'm still excited about watching a good old American stock car race. And of course, the best old American stock car race is still the Daytona 500. So that's where you would find me if I had my choice every year.
Excellent. And our last question. Which is your most cherished automotive artifact? And that can be anything from a hood ornament to a photograph to an event program to a sketch on the back of a napkin.
Well, I guess I have to say that I was probably more thrilled and more satisfied with myself and with the image that I had projected when John DeLorean asked me to write the presentation that Pontiac were going to put in front of the General Motors Corporation justifying the building of this car called GTO. I thought that was a very significant honor that he would have that kind of respect for me. I busted my proverbial to get it done, only to find out that when we got down there, they didn't even want to see it, because 15,000 orders said a whole lot more than anything I could manufacture.
Jim, I think on behalf of everybody here, a big thank you for coming out and sharing.
You might tell them that I have a
Yeah, and a small token of our appreciation, Jim. Yeah, Jim. Just a small token of our appreciation. We give you just a plaque, and then just a couple of notes. Jim's going to be around. He's got his books here and other related Jim Wangers pieces. So if you want to get yourself set up with Dave, our next lecture is going to be in April. It will be Peter Brock. For those of you who don't know, Corvette and Daytona Cobra are probably a quick reference to Peter's name. And then for every first Sunday of the month, we've been doing Cars and Coffee for 11 months, which means next month is our first anniversary. We had 415 cars unexpectedly show up in January. We'll see what comes on our first anniversary if Mother Nature's on our side. Our store's open. We do Cars and Coffee every month. There's cards about the Peter Brock lecture. And I will say that if you enjoyed this and you enjoy the events that we do here, please consider our membership program. It does help us make some of these happen. And on that note, thank you again from all of us at the museum. Thank you for coming. And Jim, again, thank you.